Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you. I'm Adria Scharf. I am with the Rutgers School of Management and Labor Relations. I'm part of the leadership team at the Institute for the Study of Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing. And I'm a sociologist, and I primarily these days study all different forms of worker-owned businesses, primarily in the US context. And I'm happy to be with you. This is my first crimped conference. So today I am going to share with you all about a brand new idea out of the state of California. And it's an idea for a potential union cooperative solution to the Fissuring workplace. And certain points of my presentation, I think, will build nicely on the last discussion of unionized cooperatives. So this particular idea has very specific origins in the state of California. In 2022, the California state legislature passed an act known as the Power Act, which mandated a study to assess this idea of an association of cooperative labor contractors, which I'll explain in just a moment. But just want to note up front that this idea in fact originated with SEIU, with the Service Employees International Union of California, which unusually in the US context is a labor union that has been very experimental and interested in and open to different worker cooperative forms. This idea was initiated by SEIU, brought to the state legislature. The original proposal from the union was for the state to actually create this association. In fact, the bill that actually passed the state legislature was a study bill, so it called for the study. So the act called for a study. And I am part of the research team that has completed the study. The study has been done by the Berkeley Haas School of Business with PI David Levine in partnership with our institute at the Rutgers School of Management and Labor Relations. And the current draft version is posted on the LWDA California government website. We're soliciting public input. It's available. We welcome feedback. And I'll just mention that one of my own contributions to this project was to really conduct the core analysis of this idea, the central idea of an association of cooperative labor contractors, and kind of wrestle it to the ground. What would it mean? What would it look like? How would it be structured? What is the empirical evidence we can bring to bear on whether such a model could be successful? And I'll mention, though, that my piece is just one component. There was a large research team, and the study includes case studies and a data analysis, a literature review. And I hope to have some of my colleagues here alongside me, but unfortunately, you have just me. I'll try to summarize some of their contributions as I go along. So I want to just sort of walk you through at a high level kind of our high level analysis of this proposed structure. And I want to just say up front that my presentation is a bit unusual. I think it's unusual perhaps for this conference. It's also unusual for me as a social scientist. Normally when I go to conferences, I'm presenting empirical research. I do comparative analysis of worker-owned structures and their different impacts on labor outcomes. This is a little bit different in that the ACLC is a proposed concept. It doesn't actually exist. Pieces of it do have analogies, empirical analogies globally, and we tried to bring as much evidence as we could to bear. But in fact, what I'm doing here is sort of unpacking this concept. Again, that's a hypothetical potential solution. So an ACLC, what did the state of California mean in requiring a study of this concept? It would have two levels. So the first would be, it would create at the organization level, cooperative labor contractors or CLCs all across the state. And you can think roughly of a CLC as a high road worker-owned staffing business structured as a worker cooperative. And then in addition to all those organizations, there would be kind of an umbrella network or an association structured as a nonprofit that would be establishing and creating and supporting all of these CLCs statewide. This association would set and monitor the labor standards within the member CLCs. It would actually provide management and leadership as needed for the member CLCs, et cetera. So again, it's a bunch of cooperative labor contractors under this umbrella association. And there's more detail, but I'll skip. Want to move quickly. So, and then just sort of zooming out a bit more bird's eye view, as you all probably here know, a worker cooperative is a business owned by its worker members, governed according to principles of one person, one vote. Each worker member owns one single share. As you probably know, cooperatives are for-profit businesses, but they balance profit imperatives with the needs of their members. And importantly, in this context, in the context of staffing and labor contracting, in a worker cooperative staffing agency, the worker members themselves, the laborers, would have the opportunity to share in any profits, which are known as patronage dividends. Whereas in the predominant models of staffing, typically profits are extracted out to the smaller group of owners or the outside investors. I'll just note that the worker cooperative sector in the United States is very small and quite fragile. The estimate is that there's between 612 and 1,000 worker cooperatives nationally that cover fewer than 10,000, between 6,000 and 10,000 workers. And at Rutgers, we have a lot of wonderful case studies of US worker cooperatives. You can find at that website, clio.rutgers.edu. So with the CLC, whereas in most worker cooperatives in the United States and globally, the worker members work together sort of within the organizational boundaries to produce a product or deliver a service, through their collective labor. In contrast, in a CLC, the workers will instead be supplying labor to external contracted entities, right? So they're going to be served, or the CLC will serve as a contractor to a client company. So in practice, they're going to function and they would most likely compete if they existed with kind of for-profit staffing agencies, farm worker labor contractors, other labor market intermediaries. So the study, called for a deep analysis of, how such a structure, this ACLC, might advance the goals of this very forward-looking future of work commission in California that proposed California should have a new social compact between workers and employers, called for us to do all these different things, which we've done in the study. And very quickly, context, outsourcing labor, the rapidly fissuring workplace. California has one of the highest concentrations of temporary contract workers in the country. In California farm sector, 46% of farm workers are in fact farm labor contractors, meaning they're not hired directly by the farm, but they are placed in farms through these intermediary LMIs. Across California and really across the country, you have the emergence of these big shadow workforces where you have employees of a large firm. A core of employees are hired directly by the firm and get good benefits in equity, compensation, and protections. And then side by side with those workers, there are these shadow workforces of staffed workers, outsourced labor, often doing the very same job as the permanent standard workers, but with much fewer benefits, job security, voice, etc. The last contextual piece is that you can't understand this idea of an ACLC in California without understanding California's regulatory context. And this has been a learning process for me as someone who lives on the East Coast of the United States. But in California in 2020, there was passed what's called AB 5 or Assembly Bill 5, which is a gig worker bill. And it's one of the strongest gig worker protection efforts at gig worker protection in the United States. This bill shifted the statutory framework around defining independent contractors and employees. It presumes that workers are employees. So it reclassified a lot of independent contractors as employees. And this bill, AB 5, basically shifted obligation, shifted responsibility back onto the core employers for these workers. So workers who had been hiring independent contractors, many of them had to transition those workers into actual standard employment relationships. So after AB 5, which was an attempt again to kind of put responsibility back on the shoulders of traditional employers, some corporations, you could think, tried to shrug off that new responsibility by seeking temporary staffing. So there was this huge spike in temporary staffing, and it's impossible really to untangle the effects of the COVID pandemic from AB5. There was this huge rise in temp staffing at that time. Again, impossible to untangle, but there's a lot of evidence that in the context of AB5, a lot of companies sort of panicked at the idea of having to shoulder responsibility for all these workers who they had been thinking of as contractors. And instead, they started to use more staffing arrangements. So there was this big move to use staff labor, in part to have the flexibility of short-term contracts, to avoid committing to a durable employment relationship, to reduce the risks of lawsuits, et cetera. But what they found was that even when a company, say an Amazon.com or a Google or a supermarket chain, even when they used outsourced labor, so even when they used a staffing agency for their workers, it turns out they were actually still liable as joint employers. So there's this thing, joint employer liability, which says that both according to the California Code and federal law, a business contracting with a staffing agency or a subcontractor or a franchise can be held accountable for the breaches that staffing agency may have. So the mothership, the mother company can still be sued, even if a franchisee, a subcontractor, or a staffing firm is the one who fails to pay adequate wages or comply with employment law. So this issue of joint employer liability is a major concern among California businesses. Okay, so I apologize for my very simple and text-heavy slides here, which I'm sort of irregular font size. But so I'm going to jump ahead and just kind of give you at a very high level some of kind of our high level analysis of opportunities and challenges of this idea. And again, this is a very unusual idea in the US context, where worker cooperatives are really a tiny little fringe in context of the larger economy, and where it's very unusual, A, to have a labor union embrace worker cooperatives, and B, to have any state legislature call for an actual formal study of an idea like this. So again, unusual idea. So among the opportunities, sort of implicit in this call to study the idea of an ACLC, this idea of the ACLC represents bold experimentation to pilot a high road model, employment model, in the context of a rapidly fissuring workplace. The California Future of Work Commission a couple of years ago had called for that kind of bold experimentation to forge a fundamentally new compact between, labor and capital, worker and employer. So again, an opportunity in a state that's kind of a first mover state in the US context. California often leads the nation when it comes to passing more progressive labor, environmental, and social policies. So again, represents an opportunity. To the literature on worker cooperatives and the larger literature on worker ownership indicates that there are potential competitive advantages in worker ownership models in terms of the potential alignment between the worker and the business, in terms of reduced turnover, in terms of work effort, et cetera. Lots of innovation, lots of different outcomes have been documented. Similarly, empirically, there are a lot of examples that suggest that there is power in federating, or power in forming networks and associations of worker cooperatives. In fact, and of course, there's Mondragon. In the US, we have a number of examples, including the Industrial Commons in North Carolina and others. But the idea of federating has been picked up as kind of this new call within the worker cooperative sector in the United States, where all across the country, there's lots of different experiments in this, of incubating, of networking, of federating, of placing worker cooperatives, which are often small in the United States, under kind of a buffering supportive umbrella, so federating. And then secondly, the economies of scale could potentially be tremendous in terms of training, benefits, technology, purchasing, et cetera. In forming an association of lots of smaller CLCs. And then last opportunity just has to do with unionizing unorganized labor segments. These CLCs would be union-friendly employers. And we know from reports, including this really wonderful report that we offer on this Rutgers website, Shifting Power, Meeting the Moment, by my colleagues, Sanjay, Camille, and Ray, there are potential synergies that have not really been tapped sufficiently in the US context between unionization, collective bargaining, and worker cooperative models, and the two together can, again, be very synergistic. So opportunities there. Now, when we really looked carefully at the data we had, and my colleagues conducted a number of very interesting case studies of individual worker-owned staffing agencies and farm worker labor contractors in California. And there were a number of challenges that we just couldn't sort of dismiss. So the first is this kind of issue of absorbing costs. So sort of societally, we are seeing a shift, again, a shift of large employers kind of shirking their responsibility toward their employees and handing them off to staffing agencies. And in a funny way, this CLC proposal, although it was proposed by a labor union, in a way it actually accelerates that shifting of cost and responsibility, so that much of the cost of providing benefits of Social Security, Medicare, workers' comp insurance would all shift from the client firm to the CLC, to the cooperative labor contractor. So the CLC would end up needing to shoulder a lot of both cost and risk and administrative complexity. So that was one challenge. Two, we found, especially in our case studies, that there is a real tension between workplace democracy and some of these temporary staffing efforts. So one of the case studies was of a healthcare staffing entity that was worker-owned, and they were placing healthcare workers in hospitals. And they just found that there was real difficulty at a number of levels, both in creating kind of a culture of workplace democracy when workers are working off-site, and then also with the temporary nature of the placements, that their workflow was very unpredictable. And sometimes the hospitals were actually hiring on board as traditional workers some of these staffing agency worker-owned. Some of the worker owners were getting hired into the hospitals themselves, so they were kind of hemorrhaging their base of workers. Securing market share was a challenge in a number of the case studies that my colleagues did. It was very hard for these worker-owned staffing agencies to identify clients, to onboard new clients, to ensure that they were building up enough job opportunities for their worker members. And that became kind of a vicious cycle where people would want to work for them, but they wouldn't have enough job opportunities, et cetera. And then a number of these models occupied kind of low margin, low road sectors. And again in the case studies and the data that we had, you saw kind of these worker-owned staffing entities wanting to pay higher wages, wanting to take a high road, but they're having to compete with really low road, bottom feeding, low wage competitors who would undercut them on price. And so there was this constant kind of downward sort of pressure because of those competitive pressures from low road competitors. Some of our recommendations for design.
Adria.
Yes,
Adria,
am I done?
Just to be fair with other presentators, your time is up. Can you conclude just briefly?
Yeah, I'll just close really fast.
Yeah, but time is up now. But you
time's up. Okay.
If you want. Yeah.
No problem. I'll just flip through my slides.
You in the chat, but I think you didn't see it. But no worries. You have maybe 30 to 45 seconds to conclude.
Okay, so we had a number of recommendations for design, which you can look at in the report, including prioritizing not temp arrangements, but these managed service staffing models, which is where the staffing agency does not place temp workers, but they in fact take on an entire contract or an entire area of work for a host firm. And then very important, we proposed a waiver of the joint employment liability for firms who are seeking labor from the CLCs. And we make a few other recommendations as well, which you can see here. And we had a lot of conclusions, but we basically cautiously recommend that the state of California explore this idea. The ACLC would provide meaningful opportunities. We encourage them to explore it. We saw real value in the umbrella structure of the association, but we urge California to be clear-eyed. We cannot ask democratic worker cooperatives CLCs to solve for these structural issues or to compete unaided with low road competitors. And so incentives, funding, et cetera, will be required. Thank you so much.